Up until this point, we've been focusing on how someone might appeal to experiments from neuroscience to challenge the existence of free will. But there's also been a challenge against free will coming from the area of social psychology in the past couple decades. In this video, we're going to start out by introducing what social psychology is, and then we're going to talk about a number of experiments that have formed the foundation of the challenge posed from social psychology against free will. We'll talk about the bystander experiment, Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, Milgram's obedience experiments, a phone booth experiment, and an honesty box experiment. So, social psychology is a field of science that studies psychological phenomenon from a specifically social perspective. So this science studies how our thoughts, attitudes, personality, and behavior can influence and be influenced by groups, situations, or social factors. So let's talk about a couple experiments. So the first experiment we're going to discuss is called the bystander experiment, and it was inspired by a sort of real-life event in 1964 in New York City. You can see the newspaper clipping from this event back then. So Kitty Genovese was violently killed in front of her apartment building, and 37 residents at the apartment building saw this happen, but nobody called the police. Nobody did anything to prevent it. So participants were left alone in a room to discuss issues for college students over a microphone or intercom system. Some believed they were discussing the issues with one other person on the system, while others believed they were discussing the issues with a group of people. Every voice they heard on the intercom system was, unbeknownst to them, actually just pre-recorded, so they weren't actually talking to anyone. Now, participants would hear a voice on the intercom express fear that they were having a stroke and about to die. Then after about 2 minutes of this sort of panicked voice, participants would hear a choking sound followed by silence or static on the intercom, making it seem like the person on the other end was in danger, possibly life-threatening danger. So what were the results of the experiment? Well, first, there was a group that heard only one voice on the intercom. And so they believed that they were the only person who heard this panicked person and who sort of knew that they were in trouble. Well, 85% of those subjects left to get help before the voice was cut off. And actually, 100% of them eventually went to go get help, but the other 15% waited till after those 2 minutes. So another group that heard two voices, so one panicked voice and then one other bystander. 62% of those subjects left to get help before the voice was cut off. And not quite 100% went even ever. And now the group that heard 5 other voices, so one panicked voice and 4 other bystanders, only 31% of these subjects left to get help before the voice was cut off. All right. So it looks like the more other sort of bystanders you think that are in this sort of situation, the less likely you are to actually get help, and the slower you will be to give help when you do. Another famous experiment from social psychology from back in the 1970s is Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. Some of you might have already sort of heard about this. You can see the advertisement in the paper to the right here. It says, male college students needed for psychological study of prison life, $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks beginning August 14th. Then you can see a picture of the sort of experiment itself. So this experiment started by an advertisement in newspapers for male college students willing to take part in an experiment on prison life, as we saw. Well, then some of the volunteers were selected as prisoners, and they were arrested, handcuffed, searched, and driven in a police car to a Palo Alto police station. Then they were fingerprinted, placed in a holding cell, and then driven to a makeshift prison in the basement of a building on Stanford's campus, where they were to remain for approximately 2 weeks. They were stripped, sprayed with deodorant, given a prison uniform, and locked in a cell. They weren't allowed to leave during those 2 weeks, and they were given 3 bland meals a day and 3 supervised toilet visits a day. And they were also given some chores to do, such as cleaning the toilets. Now, some of the other volunteers were selected as guards. They worked 8-hour shifts, and then they were allowed to go home. They were told to refer to the prisoners by numbers and not by their names, and they were told to line up and count the prisoners 3 times a day. Now, during this, the guards and prisoners' activity was videoed by hidden cameras, and there were concealed microphones that picked up the conversations. So see the book for more detail on the sort of setup of this experiment. One thing I want to mention, though, is there were, I think, 75 initial sort of volunteers. I think sort of 20 were selected around that amount, and they selected the students that they gave sort of initial sort of assessment tests to, and they chose those that were judged to be the most sort of mentally sound, mature, etc. So what were the results when Zimbardo tried to do this experiment? Well, one result was that they actually had to stop the experiment after 6 days rather than 2 weeks because prisoners suffered severe anxiety, rage, and depression. In fact, one prisoner had to be let go after about 36 hours after what Zimbardo described as a very severe mental breakdown. Many of the guards began to participate or allow in behavior that physically and psychologically terrorized the prisoners. And guards generally fell into one of 3 categories. There were those that were sort of tough but fair, those that acted as good guys who did small favors for prisoners, but there was about a third of the guards that were bullies that were hostile and abusive towards the prisoners. And the other guards, even if they weren't the bullies, still allowed that to sort of carry on. Now, you might go back to your book to sort of see a lot more detail about these kinds of results, the kind of way in which the guards sort of bullied the prisoners. But also notice there's a lot of effects on the sort of prisoners themselves about how, like, what they spent their time talking about was mainly their prison life as opposed to personal information about themselves from outside the experiment. And so all of these are the results that were observed. And again, see the book for more detail. The next experiment that's described in your book is a famous experiment by Stanley Milgram's obedience experiment. All right, now, so what was the experiment? Well, participants came in and they were told that they were participating in a project researching the effects of punishment on learning and memory. And the participant was given a role of a teacher asking a student questions. Now, unbeknownst to them, usually that student was an actor. So they thought the student was another participant, but it was sort of rigged so that the actual participant was always given the role of a teacher and the actor was always given the role of a student, even though it looked like it was random. Now, when the student gives a wrong answer, the teacher is told to administer a shock. And the shock increases in intensity with each wrong answer that the student gives. Now, the teacher administers a shock via a contraption with sort of 30 switches on it. The first is labeled 15 volts, and each lever increases 15 volts after that, so that the last in the 30 switches says 450 volts, essentially a lethal amount of electricity. All right, now, at the halfway point, the levers are labeled intense shock. Later, there's a label that reads extreme intensity shock. Even later, there is a label reading danger severe shock. Finally, towards the end of this sort of contraption, there's a label that just reads XXX. Now, after the 20th shock of the 30, the teacher hears the student pound on a wall. So the teacher can't actually see the student, but they hear the student pound on a wall. And then they receive no more answers when they ask questions. But the scientist tells them no answer is a wrong answer and instructs the subject to issue the next shock. If the teacher ever hesitates or refuses, then the scientist gives them a series of 4 stock responses. For instance, they might say, please continue, or the experiment requires that you continue. Now, if the teacher refuses after they go through all 4 stock responses, then the experiment ends and they don't go any further. Unbeknownst to the participant, the machine does not truly shock anyone. So here's a picture. On the right, you see a picture of the sort of machine itself with the levers going up all the way to 30. With the XXX, you see the danger severe shock. You see the voltage on each of these. On the left, you see the sort of experimental setup. In one room, you have the experimenter, the sort of scientist, and then you have T, the teacher, with this contraption in front of them. And then there's wires going through a wall to the teacher saw the student or the learner be put in a chair with some straps to hold them down, some buttons they can push to give their answer. And the teachers have asked the questions. The learner pushes a button to answer. And when it's wrong, then the teacher flips one of these switches, and every time going up further. All right, so the question that Milgram was trying to investigate is how much physical harm or what level of voltage shock would an average person do to another sort of stranger when an authority figure, so the scientist here, tells them to do so. So remember, the shocks are not really happening. No physical harm is being done. However, the teacher believes that they are shocking the learner. And the scientist does tell the participant that although the shocks can be extremely painful, they cause no permanent tissue damage to the student, to the learner. All right, so what were the results? And I want you to pause and think to yourself for a second, how far do you think the average person would go? How far do you think you would go in this experiment? Well, 26 of 40 subjects, so more than 50%, continued shocking all the way to the end, all 30 lovers. No participant stopped before the 20th shock, after which the subject pounds on the wall and then stopped answering questions. 5 stopped after the 20th shock. 4 stopped after the 21st shock. And the remaining 4 dropped out somewhere between the 23rd and the 29th. Now, Milgram does have other variations of this experiment, some where you can actually sort of see the participant, some where they complain about having a heart condition, and they sort of yell, I don't want to do the experiment anymore, some where you're actually so close you could touch the sort of student, and he saw similar results in all of those experiments. You can see your book for a few more details. The other thing I want to mention about the results here, which I think is important, is that the teacher, you can sort of see on video, and I have a link in the optional resources where you can watch this being done, they oftentimes seem very nervous. They tend to sort of sweat a lot. They're very sort of fidgety. It looks like they're not really comfortable with what they're doing, but they often flip the switch anyway when the scientist asks. So I'm going to mention this here, and we'll return to this idea in the next video where we discuss free will. But one of the central ideas that people have drawn from these experiments is the following. Situational factors seem to have an incredibly strong influence on our behavior. If you put a person, an average person, in the right situation, even ordinary people like you or me will A, fail to help an innocent person who's dying. That's the bystander experiment. Physically and psychologically torment their peers, the Stanford Prison Experiment, and cause severe physical harm, potentially deadly harm, to a stranger. That's the Milgram Experiment. All right, so now it should be noted, however, that situational factors can also influence people to act sort of morally and not just immorally like we've seen so far. So here's an experiment that your book doesn't mention. So this is a phone booth experiment that's quite sort of famous. And this is where there's a coin that's left in the coin return of a phone booth, and researchers observe which subjects find the coin and which ones don't. After the call, an actor, who has no idea if the subject found the coin or not, walks by as the subject is leaving the phone booth, and the actor drops a pile of papers on the ground. And then the researchers are nearby, and they watch to see whether a subject would choose or decide to help pick up the papers or not. So these were the results. 26 subjects did not find the coin. Of those, only one person, about 3.8%, stopped to help pick up the papers. 16 subjects found the coin, and of those, 14, or 87.5%, stopped to help. So this small little change concerning whether a person did or did not find the coin seemed to have a large effect on a person's decision to help. The last experiment I'll mention here is an honest box experiment. So Bateson in 2006 placed an honest box in her psychology department break room with suggested prices for various drinks. So people can get coffee, milk, tea, etc. And then there's like a little chart that says, hey, we suggest you pay $5 for a coffee or whatever it is and put it in this box. But there's nobody there to collect this or sort of make sure. It's a sort of an honesty policy. Now, above the box was always an image, but it alternated each week between a picture of flowers or a picture of real eyes sort of looking at the person. And the results they found was that on weeks with the picture of eyes, on average, people paid 2.76 times as much money for their drinks into the sort of honest box. All right, so all I wanted to make sure you understood here in this video is what the experiments were and what their results were. In the next video, we're going to look at how these experiments might be used to form a challenge to free will. So you might start thinking about that before the next video. I'll see you then.